Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what a 4-day work week means for hourly workforces. Today we have on Genevieve Webster. She is an HR expert and consultant at Be the Change HR. Genevieve is a human resource professional with over 17 years of comprehensive experience, including the areas of coaching and engagement, training, employee relations, conflict resolution, workforce planning, and performance management. She does it all. She's currently an HR pro with Be the Change HR, which provides HR outsource and consulting services for small and mid-sized companies across the United States. Genevieve, thank you so much for coming on. And I see you're frozen, but it's all good. We're going to keep the ball rolling, but I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you, Meredith. And yes, I apologize. Meredith and I have been trying to work through some tech issues this morning. And for some reason, we just can't get that picture to unfreeze. So we're hoping this catches up as we present.
We roll with the punches. We roll with the punches. It's all good.
Exactly. You know, with being in HR, I'm sure we've all been there.
Right. Exactly. And this is the world we live in, so we're gonna go with it. But to give everyone a quick lay of the land of Big Marker, our webinar platform here, we have the chat box to the right. Feel free to throw in any questions throughout the webinar. We don't have a formal Q&A at the end. So feel free to just, if the question comes up, throw it in the chat. We'll definitely get around to it. And to start off, to get everyone acquainted, we'd love to hear where everyone's dialing in from. So feel free to throw that in. In fact, I'll be sure to type in where I'm coming from. And I'd love to hear from you all. Awesome. And then we do have a couple poll questions throughout the webinar itself. Those will just come up right on the bottom left of your screen for you all to interact with. We love to hear from everybody. And then finally, if you are a SHRM PDC free certificate member or you're part of SHRM, someone from the team will reach out to you if you stay for the full 30 to 45 minutes with your PDC ID to help in your recertification process. And then finally, just to give a little background on workforce.com, we are a workforce management software company who specializes in scheduling and time and attendance. Our overarching goal is really just to help business leaders and frontline managers make the best decisions for their company. Cool. Awesome. It's really cool to see where everyone's coming in from. Welcome, Jamie, Monica, Brandy. That's so cool. Awesome. So I'd love to kickstart off with a question for you, Genevieve. Just tell me a little bit about your background, your experience in the hourly wage space, maybe working with some of those industries such as hospitality, retail, and healthcare.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, Meredith, thank you for having me here. I love doing this kind of thing and being able to connect, especially with other HR people, right? It's a bit different giving a webinar to people who are not in HR, can talk a little more frankly, a little more openly with people with that HR background. So that's always nice to be here. As Meredith said, I work for Be the Change HR. We're outsourced HR consulting. And what that means is we get to work with a really wide variety of clients. So we have, everyone from CEOs to hourly wage workers to, we have clients who are right now. We have a hospital toll worker client. We have people making mattresses. We have, a really, really wide variety. And so that makes it really interesting to approach things like this is we get to hear from really a broad spectrum of clients when they implement things such as a 4-day work week, because they're reaching out to us for help. We're working through that, and we can see it in some varieties of spaces. And even if it's not necessarily a 4-day work week, it's talking about what that flexibility looks like, different work schedules, etc. So I've been working and doing that consulting for a number of years now. And prior to that, I was in-house HR. I've been in-house for a large global engineering firm. And also for a large parent company in the food and beverage industry. So a lot of hourly workers there. So really run the gamut, as Meredith said. We're wearing a lot of hats, but really enjoying the consulting work now as it opens us up to a lot of clients and allows us to help a lot of HR people because we are seeing that variety.
That's awesome. So, you kind of touched on some of the different industries and some of the different projects that you work in within Be the Change HR. Is there any noticeable discrepancies between those hourly wage industries?
Do you mean in terms of the 4-day work week or just in general?
Just in general, and then we'll dive into the 4-day work week.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, as really every industry is different, right? I mean, you think hourly workers are hourly workers, but that's not the case. You have hourly workers who are in an administrative role in an office. They're coming in, and it's a lot more of you don't have the safety concerns necessarily. You don't have some of the other concerns that fit in. You've got workers in a more physical environment. That especially as we transition into talking to a 4-day work week, if you're looking to expand hours, if you're saying, hey, let's work 10 hours a day now, if someone's in a much more physically demanding job, that can affect it. So no, it's definitely not a one-stop,
Right.
fits everyone across the industries.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it's interesting to kind of speak on the different practices that a lot of the industries have, depending on, what their HR is doing, what their culture is like. And I even asked the question of our first poll question of the day. I asked you guys, what industry do you work in? We're getting a lot of healthcare, a good amount of hospitality, a couple museums. That's really cool. That's awesome to see. I think, being able to speak on all of that in a comprehensive sense is really important here today. And I'm excited. So to continue on, in terms of the possibility of, a 4-day work week within hourly workforces, Genevieve, what are the chances that a 4-day work week will even come to fruition for these hourly employees?
I think definitely it can happen. I think there's a big push for it right now. There's a lot of desire coming from employees. And I think, one of the things that is important to talk about, and we can do that a little further on, is making sure it's really the right fit. Right? Because there is a lot of pressure, I think, right now, and there's a lot of people asking for it. And I think personally, if it works, it can be really great, right? It can be a great retention tool. It can be great for employee engagement, and we can talk about that. But it's also making sure that it's the right fit for your industry, because it's not for everyone, right? So I think, as far as your question, I will call it out for being a little general in the sense of, it's what are the chances? I think depending on the industry, very high, and for some, very low. Right. And it's important to recognize where you fit in that spectrum. But I think if you've got, an HR team who's committed to making it happen, more importantly, leadership who's committed to making it happen, and employees who want it to happen, those are the things that kind of need to come together. And if you're missing one of those pieces, it's going to make it a lot harder. But I think overall, generally, in this, I hope we're changing the spectrum, with the pandemic, with, work culture moving into kind of a different arena. It's moving slower than I thought it would. I thought COVID would really shake things up, and it's shook things up, but not to the huge degree that I think a lot of people thought it would. Right. But we are definitely, I think, moving in that direction. So I think there's a good possibility for industries that it works in. I think it's really coming more kind of way of the future, so to speak.
Definitely. And I would love to turn that question to the audience. What is everybody's thoughts on a 4-day work week? Is this something that your industry would be able to kind of fit that mold? Are you optimistic about it? Are you pessimistic? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts as people are slowly coming in. I see a bunch of people coming in from Long Island, which is awesome. So hello, Cecilia, Yolanda, Nikki. Super cool. And then, continuing on. So is this something that even makes sense for hourly employees, or does it more just, again, depend on the industry?
As I said, I think it absolutely depends on the industry and on the company itself, right? I think a lot of people, they see this as a fix, right? They say, well, we need more employee engagement, so or we need people to be more productive. Let's offer this, right? This will bring us, better clientele coming in. We'll be able to recruit more if we offer this 4-day work week, right? And I'd say it's not the solution. This is gonna be a terrible statement, but it's like the joke where it says, in a marriage, you don't want to have a baby to fix the marriage, right? You want to have a good marriage and then have the baby, ideally. We've all done different things, but I think people look at the 4-day work week as the solution to the problem, and it really should be the result, of fixing those issues first, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I think it's interesting. I'm seeing the chat right now, and these are really awesome It's some really great insight that I'm seeing from Brandy and Hal. They're kind of on different ends of the spectrum here, but Brandy's saying, given the runtime in our food manufacturing industry, I'm not sure how feasible it is. We would likely have to increase our workforce to make up for additional days. We can certainly alternate shifts, which we do at some facilities, while Hal, on the other hand, is talking about we're socializing the 4-day option and have adopted it into management within several restaurants. We've recruited our first GM as a result. That's awesome. What are your thoughts on that, Genevieve? I think it's really interesting to kind of hear both of those perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're spot on from what we're hearing. And this is my point about that it's not a one size fits all, and it's not a cure for everyone, right? As Brandy was saying, that's a very common problem. And I have a client in a similar situation, and they did have to, when they're looking to budget this out, you think, well, it's the formula 100, 80, 100, right? If you're keeping the pay percent, working 80% of the hours, but for 100% of the productivity, right? Mm-hmm. That's the goal. And if you look at that, you think, well, it'll be cost neutral because we're still getting the same amount of work. It's just in less time. We're still paying the same salaries, right? But what we're seeing from a lot of clients, especially in industries that are very client focused, or she's saying, runtime in food manufacturing, you've also got restaurants working shifts. Anyone who has to have, client facing people out there they need that coverage. So it's not as simple to just say, everyone gets Friday off, right? You have to look at that. And, I did have a client who had to build into the budget. They did have to hire additional people, right? And they did, an ROI on that. They looked at it and they were able to make it work because, it really was a benefit. It did, they did have more engaged staff. They had longer, better retention of that staff. And these were the benefits they were looking at. And also being able to recruit, as we all know, it's a tough market right now to be bringing people in. And so they really wanted to offer that benefit. But in order to do that, they did have to increase the workforce. And they included that in their budgeting when they were looking at that. But that's something definitely to keep in mind, because I think a lot of people see it as a cost neutral. And it can be. It certainly can be, especially for industries that really fit into that right niche slot. But for some industries, you do have to, look at the coverage. You can also look at the, kind of alternate schedules, right? So people think, again, 4-day work week means Fridays off. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be Friday. It doesn't have to be the same day for everyone, right? You can have a set series. I had a client who did menus, right, where it said they gave three choices that people could choose from, and it was based on department. It was based on what made sense for the business. For some of those, it was a Tuesday, right, because they needed coverage for those 5 days a week. And I think Brandy mentioned that as well, alternate shifts, right? But this is all stuff you need to think about ahead of time. And again, it's not just everyone gets Friday off, we're done, right?
Right, exactly. There's got to be some sort of compensation, it seems.
Right. And I think with Hal's point, the adopting into management, that's a lot easier to do, right? Management usually has the more sets. Well, management in a restaurant maybe not have set schedules. So I've been in some restaurants that are busy all over the place, but right. It's more easier to do at a management level. And as you saw, I think that's great that you're able to recruit a GM off of that. And I think we'll see more and more of that. More people are looking for that as an option, right? And they're taking that into effect too when they're doing salary negotiations. What are the hours for that? And I think, as Hal said, they said they're socializing it and adopting into management. I'd be curious, is the plan to adopt it, further out as you go? What does that look like? So that's very common that we're seeing those kind of discrepancies there, but it can be done. You just have to think about it, think about those logistics.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting to note that Hal is talking about extending it out to 12-hour days opposed to 8-hour days. And Marianne, we're talking more on that 32-hour week, but I would love to hear kind of more, from more Hal's perspective, if anyone else kind of caters to that, where they are just extending the workday. And I'm curious, how are you guys dealing with that overtime hours? Because I think that's something where it gets a little tricky around this time, where you obviously want to maintain that compliance. You want to make sure that everybody's getting their breaks. But obviously it's hard to keep track of when your work week isn't necessarily considered the norm or the regular as of now, at least. Maybe in a year's time, 4-day work weeks will kind of take over. So I'm curious on everyone's thoughts. Awesome. So, and then in terms of, what I thought was really interesting when I was researching this is we've seen a lot of studies in Europe have been experimenting with 4-day work weeks for quite some time, actually. And there seems to be some mixed results depending on how long these studies go for. What do you believe, Genevieve, HR needs to do to make sure that those who want to roll out a shorter work week is ultimately a success?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, those studies are very interesting. There's a lot going on with them. And I know you say mixed results. I do think they've been skewing more positive. Yes, certainly mixed, but, I have been seeing more of the results. And they actually just started a huge one in the UK this month, first of this month, I think. So it'd be very interesting to see the data coming out of that. There's also one in the US that just started as well, and some are waiting for that June. Some kicked off with the UK as well. So you've got there should be a lot of good data coming out. I believe they're doing 6-month trials. So coming up, second half of the year, we should be able to get to see what the results of those are. But as far as to go back to your question, what HR can do to that, it's really looking at, as I said, looking at your workforce and seeing what do you want? What is your goal with the 4-day work week? Right? Why are you doing it? Is it that, productivity? Is it the, just because employees are asking for it? Is it because, you heard it's a good thing and you want to offer it? What are you looking to accomplish with that? And then I think we've all been there in HR, right? Probably where you've had to have enforced something. And it's coming down and it's basically saying, right, HR is telling you to do this. Mm-hmm. And it usually does not go over as well as you would like necessarily. As we know, it's much better if you have employee buy-in, right? And I think that's really important, is to make sure it's something your employees want, to make sure it's something that they are interested in. And you can do surveys, there are many ways to gauge that, and also gauge, exactly what they're looking for. Some people don't necessarily want a 4-day work week. They want a flexible week. Right. I think I saw, and forgive me, it's hard to follow the chat and talk at the same time, but I thought I saw a question someone was asking, well, wait a minute, are we doing, reduced, are we doing 32 hours in a week, or are we doing 40 hours in 4 days?
Right.
That is what you want to look at. Are you, there's a 410, there's 980s, there's these different schedules, and you do need to follow, you mentioned, Meredith, the overtime laws. You do need to follow the overtime laws, especially I'm from California. So I speak from that perspective, which is very strict. And there's wage orders that you need to follow from Department of Industrial Relations. For California, it's wage order 4, but it really lays it out for you when you have to pay overtime and when you don't, right? So you will want to make sure that you're checking that for your state, because that will say, hey, if you're implementing this, if you work, a lot of people do the 410, you're working 4 days a week for 10 hours, right? Mm-hmm. So that's keeping your hours the same. So it keeps them whole for your hourly employees, right? It keeps their pay whole. But not everyone wants to work a 10-hour day, even though they're getting a day off, right? Myself, I got to pick up kids. I can't do 10 hours that way. That doesn't work for me. And so if HR is coming and saying, oh my gosh, guys, we've given you this amazing benefit, we're going to vote, we're doing a 4-day work week. I say, well, wait a minute, I don't want that, right? So it's really knowing your employees. And I know I apologize, I've got a bit off track from your question here, but I think HR having the support and the buy-in of the employees is really important to make that work. And that's something, we can certainly discuss later. There are many tools to get that as well. If you're not sure, as I said, there's surveys, you can look at that, but I think really making sure it's something the employees actually want.
Right. And I would love to point to this slide really quickly, just to kind of highlight one of these studies that I was talking about in Europe. And this is something where, the first paragraph, the first quote on the top talks a little bit about like those benefits that we've been talking about, the engagement, productivity aspect. The second one talking a little bit about the mixed reviews that we've been seeing, but the last one is talking about how, we've kind of been rolling this out. And I think it's really interesting, and going back to Marianne's question, talking about, are we talking 32 hours or 40? Maybe that 40 would work if it's something where, we're talking dispersed amongst more employees. Obviously, that's a lot hard. That's a lot easier said than done, especially in today's labor market. But I just found this really interesting, and especially the second quote, talking the research into the impact of shortened weeks on the broader economy is mixed. Studies on the university economists out of Germany and France found that fewer hours didn't necessarily increase employment. I thought that was a very interesting quote right there. And then I would love to refer to Hal's comment in the chat. I asked, how is overtime working? And he's saying that OT is offsetting the demand for higher wages, thus pay the OT for the availability. I think that's a really interesting way to go about it. And, to plug workforce.com, we deal with a lot of that. We deal with managing overtime and making sure that labor costs still remain low while you're getting the most out of your employees, keeping in check with compliance, all that good stuff. So customizing flexible schedules is huge on our end as well.
Cool. And I will say, sorry to interrupt you. I will say that is something really important and will make your life a lot easier as HR if you do have an HRIS, something like Workforce that can help you track this. Again, I have clients that are still, don't get me started on Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
This is something,
HR.
Right. And depending on how many employees you have and how many schedules you're managing, something to help manage that is important. And we've all, if been through an implementation of any systems, it takes time. So it's nice to have that on board before you're trying to also change schedules, right?
Definitely.
And I think that can really be helpful. And to touch on the overtime laws, as I said, I think as you mentioned, Hal makes a good point. You can take that into your factoring, right? Is that that overtime, but you also need to make sure, as I said before, that you're following those wage orders, that you're following what's laid out. There is a process you need to follow if you do decide to go this route. The hourly employees need to vote on it. There's everything goes in place, and there's a really great SHRM article that I can send out that walks you through. Again, I speak more specifically for California. The good news is it's easier to do in other states. California likes to make things complicated. But I will say for your state is just take a look at the wage orders and see, because, again, in states, especially states like New York that have hourly overtime, if it's more than 8 in a day versus the weekly overtime, you want to make sure you're compliant. And so what happens with that is if they don't, and you have the hourly schedule, you can then change it so they're not getting overtime unless it's more than 10. So that's how you can have those 4-day weeks where they're working 10 hours a day, right? There's a process you need to follow. It's pretty well laid out, actually. Surprisingly, it's an easy government thing to follow. Mm-hmm. But just, again, since we've got a lot of people here from different states, some states are very easy. They don't have as big a requirements. California, New York, other states, etc. You're going to have more of a process to follow. So if you're thinking of doing this, I would recommend looking at your wage order and then also just checking with an employment attorney before you move forward. I would do most of the work yourself because we don't want to pay the employment attorney rates. Love them as I do, but it's definitely something HR can do. But especially if you're in a state with daily overtime, I would just have an employment attorney kind of bless it for you.
Definitely. Very good points. I would love to turn to the topic of the impact on productivity and customer satisfaction. This is a huge, what many see as a drawback of the 4-day work week is, well, if fewer hours are worked, my customer satisfaction will drop. To turn quickly to this slide that I pulled, this New Zealand study, and for those, the print is quite small on the bottom, but going from the left bar to the right, it's talking about the productivity boost. We saw a 20% increase, less stress, saw around a little less than 25 to 30%, and then better work-life balance, nearly 50%, around 45%. I thought this was really interesting. And my question for you, Genevieve, what makes a productive workplace to even begin with, speaking from an HR professional?
I think definitely an engaged workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Right? People are not going to work hard for something they don't care about, right? And that can be, again, I don't mean that they don't have to care and, bleed company blood. It could just be, I want to make my paycheck, right? But they need to be committed. They need to be engaged and have a reason for being here, right? And I think the productivity is an interesting one, right? Because it's touted as both a benefit and a con of the 4-day work week. And I think the talk around it has shifted since the pandemic, right? Because before COVID, if I was, when talking to a client about implementing this, it said, hey, it's not about, yes, it's about fitting 5 days of work into 4 days, right? But you can't just do that without giving employees tools to do it, right? And looking at your work first, right? So before, we dive into that, we would look at a company and look at the client and say, okay, where are we trimming this fat? You've got all these meetings, or you've got, what are you doing? Looking at job descriptions, seeing does it make sense, for the roles, is there overlap, reducing that so that you're not just trying to cram everything into 4 days versus 5 days, because that's where you actually see a drop in productivity because people burn out. And also, if you are doing that 4-10, where you're having people work 10-hour days, 10 hours is a long time to be at work. And,
yeah.
I think there was a study done, there's been a few, but this was pre-COVID, that people only, when they're in the office, they only spend, it's under 3 hours, like 2 hours and 50 minutes actually working. The rest of the time is, socializing, checking email, doing that. And so I think people, if you're looking at that, you think, well, we can just move that into 4 days and cut all of that. And, before COVID, there was lots of talk about how do we do that. And now companies that are still remote have removed a lot of that, right? And people working from home, you don't have the time, you don't have the coming into the office, getting coffee, etc. But people now are starting to go back to the office. So I think, that conversation is going to come up again. And also for, again, people at home, we really want to look at the roles and see what's making sense. Where can you change things around versus just telling everyone to fit 5 days of work into 4. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And my follow-up question here, I guess, is, what are we seeing with the relationship between productivity and fewer days worked? Does that mean because, we're trying to cram those 2.5 hours of productivity every day into a longer day? Does that, dwindle the actual productivity aspect? Does it, have an impact on customer satisfaction?
It can. And I think that's where the data coming out of these pilots is going to be really interesting to see, right? And I think if it's something you're looking to implement, at your company, I would also think about, what your metrics are, right? What are you using to measure productivity? Because especially if you're, if you want to look at your numbers at the end of the year, and say, hey, we're more productive, based on what, right? Yeah. So that's something to factor in, is looking at that and seeing, okay, what are the metrics, and maybe it's just, these are our sales numbers, or these are, we're delivering on. Certain industries, it'll be harder to measure, right? But I think looking at that too and seeing where that fits into your productivity. But yeah, it really can. We've seen, again, a lot of the studies, I know you had that quote from the one in France that didn't see that, but, I do think overall, it seems to be people who are thinking that they can be, as productive in that time. But as I said, it's not just taking your existing model and shoving it into 4 days. They can be as productive, but they need to be more focused during that time. They need to be able to, you're eliminating an entire day of work. So what, are you eliminating so that can fit? And as a company, your bottom line, you still need to deliver the same thing, right? So they still need to be able to do the same amount of productivity for you. But, what can we look at in terms of the roles? What can we move around so that they can actually be successful in that?
And I think talking about metrics, those KPIs, those key performance indicators, I think that's really, and we've touched on this in a past couple of webinars, I think it's really important that everybody kind of has their finger on the pulse on that sense. And I'm curious, I'm going to throw a question out for the audience, is do you guys have a good feel of your metrics? Is KPI something that your organization really focuses on? Is it something that you guys maybe put off or don't necessarily put time or effort into? I'm curious on what your thoughts are. While I wait for those answers in the chat, I would love to turn to this slide on a slide that talks about, does a 4-day work week make employees more productive? 22% say fixing a problem caused by someone else. And they were able to accomplish that with a 4-day work week. Completing administrative tasks increased by 17%. Attending meetings, 12%, checking, answering emails, 11%, and then dealing with customer issues, 11% increase. I think this is really interesting, to kind of look at. And Genevieve, I'd love to hear your thoughts just on this graph right here.
I'd be curious, and I sorry, it's small print, the date of this, if this was done pre or post pandemic. But yeah, I think that's absolutely, probably spot on. I think in the top there, it says nearly half of them think they could do their job in less than 5 hours each day, right? And I think a lot of, again, people think the 5 hour, the 4-day work works for them, and it doesn't, right? Unless you're looking at these and fixing these issues first. And I think being in HR, you also know, some of these are absolutely could be issues that you need to fix. Some of these are maybe employees seeing, they might not think a meeting is necessary, but it is, right? And that's just part of their job. So it's addressing that too, so that they feel those things, what is necessary and what's not, right? I find it interesting fixing a problem caused by someone else is the first one, right?
Yeah.
This is where doing this type of survey with your individual company, can be interesting. And you can do it anonymously if you want to. You can Google Docs. There's all sorts of ways you can do it, or you can just talk to people. But this would be interesting to maybe do beforehand too, and see, hey, where are the things we need to eliminate, right? And if I got this back from my company, I'm going to be like, well, wait a minute, why is everyone fixing problems caused by someone else? Where is that gap? Do we have someone who's not performing, someone's not doing their job, or is the job descriptions, the rules not clear? Do we need to look at that? You can do kind of a rule analysis. Administrative tasks, is there a way to streamline that, right? Again, if you're doing time cards and people are putting those in Excel, is it easy to get an app for that? Those things cost money, of course, so you want to look at that as well. I think with COVID, it's the, do these meetings need to happen? Although, interestingly, I've actually had quite a number of clients who have increased meetings. They're all over Zoom. But because they have concerns about everyone working from home, what are they doing? They've increased those meetings, which is why I'm curious as to the date of this, because that's causing a different problem. Is people say, well, now I'm in all these Zoom meetings because you don't trust me to be at home doing my job. So
I actually double checked, and this was right before COVID hit. So this is November of 2019 that this article came out.
Got it. So yeah, it's interesting to look about that, but I think really looking at your organization holistically and seeing, where do we fit into this, right? You might not have these same issues, right? But where are those issues? How can we trim the fat so that we can make that 4-day work week successful? Because as I said, I think absolutely it can be successful for certain industries and for certain areas, but it's not the fix, it's the result of the fix.
Definitely. And I would love to, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on. I think it's all, awesome insight. I think it's really interesting. I asked that KPI question to the audience. Most, I would say Mary Ann is saying there's no KPIs here. Hal is saying we definitely measure KPIs, labor, guest service, sales, etc. I think that's awesome. How can, the audience wrap up their KPIs and turn in measuring their productivity, if that makes sense? It
doesn't actually. Can you restate it? Apologies.
For sure. So how can someone like Hal, who has those metrics, who has those KPIs under belt, how can they take that and measure their productivity against a 4 versus a 5-day work week, let's say?
Got it. Yeah. So it's great if you are measuring them. If you're not, I know, again, I have a ton of clients who are not, right? You're busy running the business. It's not something you think of until you have time to breathe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
But it can be, again, something good to have in place, and it can start small, right? You don't need to be overwhelmed by being like, oh, we have to do all of our KPIs, right? You can take something and start there and move on. But as far as your question with Hal, he's already measuring them, which is great. You've got that in place. And I would say, you have the date before you start, and you want to take those measurements incrementally as you go through this process, right? And I would say make sure that you do have them broken down if you're doing it by different departments, different sections, etc. Right? You want to look at that because you may see as you go through it that it's not working for certain areas, right? So maybe your admin is how did your management, right? They're being more productive, but look, your customer service, your sales, they're not. We're getting more customer complaints because everyone's out on Friday, or they're not getting the responsiveness. So I think it's great to have the KPIs, and I would say if you don't have them, or if you do already have them, make sure they're as specific as possible, right? So that you have it by department, you have it by section, because that will make it easier to measure, as you go forward. But I would definitely, take a temperature check before you get started, right? Say, hey, it's at this date, and then you go. A lot of people are doing, kind of piloting a 4-day work week, right? And I will say, when it comes to the pilot, you just, again, you can't just call it a pilot and then ignore overtime laws, right? Unfortunately, law doesn't work that way. You can't say, we're piloting, we're going to do it. So you still have to go through the whole process of following the wage order and all of that. But you could pilot, again, some more flexibility, right? You could pilot, doing that and say, hey, let's work an adjusted schedule. We'll still pay you the overtime. But if you're switching fully to the 4-day work week, that's when you have to go through that process with the overtime laws. But you can dip your toes in and talk to them about these things. Say, right, here's our key KPIs here. We're going to try this, again, with an alternate schedule, measure KPIs in the middle. And a lot of people do kind of a 6-month one. I would say if you're starting out and you're seeing how it works, I would do it sooner than that, right? Just to take, again, take the measurement, and also to check in with the employees, right? How is this going? Especially when you first start. I do it after the first month. You don't necessarily need to do it every month. But I would do 1, 3, and 6 when you first get started. And then, of course, you can let it go longer than that. But you often see in the very beginning, this is wonderful, this is great. And then as it kind of goes through, it's saying, well, wait a minute, I've got all of, Bob's work now because he has Fridays off and I'm on Tuesdays, and this doesn't make sense.
Right.
So it's important to measure early and measure often when you're first starting out, and then you can kind of dial that back a bit.
Definitely. I asked a poll question. I said, have you seen a correlation between customer satisfaction and amount of hours worked? And the majority are saying no, not necessarily. And I'm wondering if this might be because, they don't necessarily have the metrics on it, or they don't necessarily have, they haven't piloted a 4-day work week yet. It's a lot of things. But I think what's really key, what Genevieve said, is starting small is really important, and kind of building your way up and really just narrowing down, okay, what do the KPIs look like, even based off team? If you're in the restaurant industry, talking about KPIs that might differ from front of house to back of house, I think that's really important to take in consideration, but not necessarily lining them up back to back, maybe doing like 3 metrics that you're measuring against for each team, and then piloting a 4-day work week and seeing how that works for you. And again, as Genevieve mentioned, the law doesn't necessarily give you a hall pass. So be sure to take that into consideration also. But easing into it, I think, is very, very important.
Right. And those metrics for, again, you have your sales numbers, all of that, but you can also easily do metrics as far as employee satisfaction. Take 5 minutes, do a Google survey. Send it out in the beginning and say, hey, how is this working? Put a few questions in there. You can make it anonymous. And that's an easy way to get that. You can also use that before you implement to see, to gauge the interest. But I will say, if you're throwing it out there, you want to make sure you're not just gauging interest and never doing anything about it. So make sure, that there is some buy-in before moving forward. But those kind of things can be easy. And that's an easy metric to put into place is employee engagement, right? You do a quick survey, on that beforehand, and then a quick survey after, and see if it's increased.
Definitely. And what's great, again, to plug Workforce, we do shift surveys where after each shift, employee fills out the survey. So that's something that, again, super easy, automated, that you can immediately get some metrics on, barely lifting a finger. So those are really important as well. I would love really quickly just to talk and touch a little bit on the correlation with the job market and labor costs. Generally, does a shorter work week mean more hiring success within the tight job market?
I think so. Of course, the caveat is always depends on industry, but I think you've got a really, really tough job market right now, and people are looking for this kind of thing. I will say, especially if you have, a younger workforce coming in, we're seeing that more and more. Wanting that flexibility, the appeal of, 3-day weekends all the time. But you're also seeing it from the older workforce, from people coming in, from people who are parents, from people who, just want a better work-life balance. There's been a real push for that recently. So yeah, I think absolutely. Again, if it's done correctly, right, and if they want to make sure salary, OT, and all of that is lined up. But it can definitely help, I think, from a recruiting perspective, if you can offer that. And again, it's not for everyone, but you can also explore other things. Like I have a client who's doing summer schedules, right? So they do the 4-day work week, but only during the summer, because that's when they have, again, kids off of school. Sorry, I keep using parental examples because I am one, but there are many other things besides being parents that people would want to have this benefit. But summer hours, for example, that can be something. So it doesn't have to be a all or nothing, right? But yeah, I think from a recruiting perspective, that does definitely help. You also want to make sure that you're clear with that, because again, you've got all the buy-in, you've got everyone agreed, and then someone leaves, and you're looking to hire, and again, they might be someone who doesn't want to work a 10-hour day. And then you say, well, now what do we do? We've got this position, we've got it all worked out, right? So I think being upfront in the recruitment, if that's what you need and that's what you want, again, a lot of people are looking for that benefit. Some people are not, right? So I think being clear when you recruit what that position is, right? Is it flexible, or is it a 4-day, 10-hour one? Is it, so I think it's just looking at that, but I think absolutely it can help from a recruitment perspective. And it can also help as far as those, labor costs go, right? If people are looking for that coming in. So
Definitely. And I'm sure, those who have experimented are able to see their labor costs changing dramatically with a 4-day work week. And it would be interesting to see kind of industry to industry, maybe in the future when more studies come out about this, how those labor costs are changing, whether for better or for worse. And obviously, as we stated at the beginning, that really just heavily depends on the industry you work with. And it would be interesting to see.
No, it definitely does. I mean, again, we've seen a lot of people, think of it as kind of this cost neutral, because with the labor costs, especially someone who has a big, if you're in a big office, you're reducing your carbon footprint. If you're able to do a schedule where you're closed every Friday, that's a full day. You're not paying electricity. You're not, well,
right, very true.
Going, but you're not, you reduce those costs. But you've also got industries who need someone there every day of the week, right? So you don't have that cost savings there. So it can really, it can really vary. But, I think it's definitely something worth exploring if you think it will work for your industry, because it can help, especially in this really tight labor market, from a recruitment perspective.
I love that. And then to kind of close out with this one final question, Genevieve, what are 1 or 2 top tips, actions, takeaways that you can share with the audience in possibly rolling out a 4-day work week?
I would say make sure employee needs align with operational needs, right? So making sure, again, really thinking about if it's something that works for your industry, and then making sure that it's, ideally more employee driven, than HR or leadership driven. So that would probably be my biggest one. And then secondly is, of course, to put my HR legal hat on, is make sure you check your wage order. And especially if you're in an hourly overtime state, do a quick check with your employment attorney.
Right. Definitely. Well, that's great. As we're coming up on time, I would love to, I see Liz, you asked a question in the chat. I'm going to throw in Genevieve's email. Genevieve, if that's okay with you, just in the chat, if anybody has any questions, feel free to email her, and, she would be happy to walk you through it. But before everybody goes, I would love to share this audit for everybody. It should show up right on the bottom left of your screen. But are you guys ready for a 4-day work week? Feel free to take it. We would love to just get a gauge, and we'll share those results with you at the end. So feel free to click on that link. And then finally, if you stuck around for the whole thing, thank you so much, first of all. And we'll be sure to contact you with the SHRM PDC ID if you are interested. So we will be reaching out to you shortly after the webinar. Genevieve, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a great conversation. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. But thank you again.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I know people are jumping off. I can just really briefly speak to Liz's question is personally no, because you have to plan that out in terms of people switching schedules. So they might have, again, a 4-day work week where Bob's off Friday and someone else is off Tuesday, et cetera. And, you can have a process in place where they can switch schedules. And what we are finding is more people are able to stack their appointments. So if you have doctor's appointments, et cetera, and you always know you have that one day off a week, that's when they should be doing those, right? And that's part of the communication when you roll this out. So yeah, I'd say we are seeing a difference, but in a positive sense, right? Because they're more able to plan their doctor's appointments, et cetera, and move those around. But just want to touch on that quickly. But yes, thank you very much for having me. It's been great talking to you all, and appreciate Meredith and Workforce for having me on.
Yeah, we'll have to do a part 2 once it's more rolled out nationally.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how those study goes. And this is only a 45-minute one where we barely touched. There's so much you could talk about with this topic. So
definitely. And for those who are interested in the SHRM code, we'll be sure to reach out to you all after the webinar. You'll be hearing from my team. And until next time, we'll see you all at the next webinar. Thank you again.